Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 5 minutes.
In this week's Climate Curious, recorded live at TED, we're catching up with our fave fossil fuel slayer, Tzeporah Berman. She joins us to give us an update on the shift she's seeing in the dialogue around the F word, fossil fuels and climate change. Over to Tzeporah to share more about how the social norms are starting to shift in the right direction. Stay curious.
What do you think has been one of the biggest shifts that you want to highlight in the conversation that you've seen that's impacted your work?
This last year, we have seen a massive shift in the dialogue around climate change and climate urgency, and specifically connecting it to fossil fuels. And it's funny, when a social norm starts to shift, it almost sounds weird to say that. Like, I was talking to a reporter at Climate Week, and I said, this is the first time we've had a Climate Week where we're talking about fossil fuels. And he said, oh, that's crazy. That's not possible. And it's funny, when you're inside of it, it looks so obvious. Fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. They're oil, gas, and coal is 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere, causing the floods and fires and storms. And for the past 30 years, fossil fuels have been invisible in the climate negotiations, in climate policy debates at a national level and at an international level. And in the last year, that's been broken wide open.
Right.
And it's fascinating, at the climate change negotiations in Dubai, there was the big dominant conversation was about the need for a fossil fuel phase out. At Climate Week last week in New York, you had Jane Fonda on stage, Al Gore, Gavin Newsom, all sticking it to the oil industry. And I was invited to speak on stage about the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I think the conversation has broken open, and I think it will change climate politics forever.
This is incredible, because I think that even in the very few years that I've been involved in these conversations, I've seen this shift as well. And I'm curious if you have obviously work like yours has been a massive driver in this shift, but is there something that you feel has caused it, or any domino that's really fallen?
It's interesting, when you do this type of work, you're always looking for the silver bullet on what made the change. And in this case, I think, look, social change happens at tipping point moments, and tipping point moments happen because of a buildup of different things. And I think that this shift is happening on the backs of frontline communities and Indigenous communities who have been standing up and organizing and protesting and going to jail. Yeah. From Standing Rock to the heart of the Amazon to oppose new oil and gas and coal developments. It is, and increasingly effectively doing that. But I also think it's because of the incredible work of divestment, the divestment campaign of fossil fuels, because of the finance and insurance campaigns that have been growing over the last 5 years from the Sunrise Project. And yes, because of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. When we launched 3 years ago, our first campaign in Glasgow was billboards and social media ads that said, time to say the F words at COP. And it was to force a conversation. So reporters and politicians, what do you mean say the F words? Most people didn't know that the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words fossil fuels or oil, gas, or coal, because the fossil fuel industry has been so successful in making their products invisible in this entire debate and complicating climate policy so that it doesn't regulate their products.
Right. So to follow up with that, one of my questions, I want to ask about the developments with the treaty, but before we get there, I want to ask you if you've seen a shift in tactics. Like, what should we as activists, as citizens, as just people who care, be looking for in the shift in tactics from the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, there absolutely has been, and there's you can see a trajectory from the early days of burying the science and denying climate change, which we now have documented in the Exxon knew and other climate litigation around the world. They knew about it, they buried the science, and then they denied it. Then they shifted when they could no longer do that because we were experiencing the fires and the floods and the storms, and people are experiencing climate change. They shifted their strategy towards delaying climate progress. And the work of Influence Map is an incredible organization to follow, where they have actually looked at how the fossil fuel industry has funded lobbying and public relations campaigns to slow down the implementation of climate policy. And they had a strategy of just making it so complicated that policy was dependent on the modeling.
Right.
You know, and so then they could create these concepts like net zero, or take over these concepts like net zero and offsetting, and play with the numbers, because they will out-resource us. These are the most profitable companies on earth. The oil and gas industry has made $2 billion a day in profits every day for the last 50 years.
I can't even $2
billion
comprehend.
a day in profits. And our governments are subsidizing them, and the subsidies have gone up. The IMF reports that last year they were $11 million a minute. This year they're $13 million a minute. In our governments, giving taxpayer dollars to these most profitable companies.
This is our money.
Yeah, because these companies are so politically powerful. So they delay progress. They distort the conversation with throwing enormous amounts of money and time at the modeling and integrating themselves into the negotiations at the United Nations process, but also at a domestic level. But the new thing, I talk about it as going from denial to delusion. So they have spent enormous amounts of money on two things. One is trying to convince the world that they're going to solve this with technology.
Right.
No, we don't have to. We can still drill for more oil and do more fracking and LNG projects. That's fine, because we're going to reduce the emissions per barrel using carbon capture and storage. Right. And major governments, UK, United States, Canada, Australia, are helping fund these carbon capture and storage projects and still approving new oil and gas development, even though the projects aren't working.
Right.
They're not working anywhere at scale. In fact, if you look globally, they're probably sequestering about 2 to 5% of what they promised.
Right.
So,
which isn't even 2 to 5% of the problem. It's
No,
just
what they promised. It's absurd, right? It's not working. It's too expensive. And if we spent that equivalent amount of money just on electrification infrastructure and renewable energy, we would reduce tons and tons of emissions. So on the carbon capture and storage is their new delusion, but then they're also trying to convince people, no, don't divest. Work with us, because we're going to become energy companies. We're going to transform from being fossil fuel companies to being the solution of clean energy companies. And they have spent an enormous amount of money on public relations to talk about their few renewable energy projects. Again, if you look, though, at the data, 98% of their capex of the largest fossil fuel companies is going into more fossil fuels.
Right.
They're spending about 2% of their own money to expand renewable energy. They're not part of the solution. They're part of the problem. And they're just trying to continue to get access to our governments and to our international processes. And that's where we need to stand up and say no. We need to make sure our elected officials know that we don't accept the oil and gas companies on our commissions, in our negotiating bodies at the UN, as part of processes to design legislation, because these companies are not going to design their own demise. Right. They're always going to be distorting the process so that they can make more money and drill for more fossil fuels.
Right. So I want to talk about the treaty and about the progress and about what are some highlights. I remember we talked to you in 2021 when
I was launching it.
Yeah, when you did your countdown talk, you were launching it. It was like an explosive moment at Countdown for people. We've updated since then, but really tell me, because it feels like following your work, there's been this kind of this curve that of take up and people coming on board with the treaty, and talk me through that a little bit.
A year ago, we had 2 countries and a big idea.
Right.
Today, we have 12 countries that have already endorsed, and we think we could have 20 by the end of the year.
Incredible.
That's really significant, because if you look at the formation of other major treaties, landmines, chemical weapon bans, these treaties started with a small group of countries, 20 to 30 countries,
right, that
with a high ambition.
Okay.
And they created the rules, designed the treaty, and then more countries joined. Last year, even though there was an incredible increase in renewable energy development around the world, only 2% of renewable energy development is in developing countries.
Yes.
And so how do we ensure equity in the energy transition? That's what the Fossil Fuel Treaty is working on. And we now have 12 countries, including Colombia, which is, look, Colombia is the 6th largest coal exporter in the world.
Okay, wow.
And they have endorsed the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And President Petro in Dubai, when he gave his speech on why he was endorsing the Fossil Fuel Treaty, he said, this is a matter of life over death, and we choose life.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon. Until next time.
Stay curious.